You think medieval sieges were all about catapults and boiling oil. Wrong. The real warfare was happening in the stomach. While Hollywood shows knights munching on turkey legs between battles, the actual menu during a siege would make a prison cafeteria look like fine dining. We're talking rat kebabs, leather soup, and if you were really desperate, something historians delicately call alternative protein sources. Spoiler alert, it wasn't tofu. If you love history, weird stories, and meals that violate several Geneva Conventions, welcome to Food Storic. Hit subscribe before the hunger sets in. Let's set the scene. The year is 1347, and you're trapped inside the walls of Calais during the English siege. Edward III has surrounded your city with his army, and nobody's getting in or out. The siege will last 11 months. 11 months. That's 330 days of increasingly creative definitions of the word edible. Now here's where it gets properly mental. Medieval cities weren't designed for extended food storage. Sure, they had granaries and salt stores, but they were banking on maybe a few weeks of trouble, not nearly a year of starvation. The average city kept about 3 months of grain on hand. After that, improvisation time. Day 1 of a siege, everyone's still optimistic. The bakers are working, the butchers have meat, and the taverns are pouring ale like nothing's wrong. By day 30, rationing kicks in. By day 60, you're eyeballing your neighbor's dog. By day 90, well, let's just say the city's rat population experiences a dramatic decline. Here's what people don't realize about siege warfare. The attackers weren't trying to break down the walls half the time. They were trying to wait you out. Starvation was the weapon, and it was brutally effective. A city under siege became a countdown timer to cannibalism, and everyone knew it. So what exactly was on the menu during these delightful extended stays in your own city? Let's start with the good news. For the first few weeks, you'd actually eat surprisingly well. Cities facing siege would slaughter all their livestock immediately. Can't feed animals when you can barely feed people. And meat doesn't keep. So week 1 was ironically a carnivore's paradise. Beef, pork, chicken, goose, anything with a pulse got turned into dinner. But here's the kicker. Without refrigeration, all that meat had to be preserved immediately. Salt was worth its weight in silver during peacetime. During a siege, might as well be made of unicorn tears. They'd salt what they could, smoke what they couldn't, and pray the weather stayed cool. The real staple, unsurprisingly, was bread. But siege bread wasn't your nice crusty sourdough. As flour supplies dwindled, bakers got creative. And by creative, I mean desperate. They'd cut wheat with sawdust, ground acorns, chestnuts if you were lucky, tree bark if you weren't. By month 3, bread was a generous term for what was essentially edible wood fiber. One account from the Siege of Orleans describes bread that was black as coal and heavy as iron. That's not poetic exaggeration. When you're grinding up whatever organic material won't immediately kill you and calling it flour, you get some interesting textures. Your daily bread ration went from 2 pounds to 1 pound to 8 ounces to, here's some bark paste. Good luck. Meanwhile, the rich were playing a completely different game. While peasants gnawed on bark bread, nobles still had their private stores. Wine cellars, preserved fruits, even sugar. Sugar. In medieval times. That's like having a private jet during the apocalypse. The class divide during sieges wasn't just wealth. It was literally who got to keep their teeth. But wait, it gets worse. Water. That basic human necessity. During a siege, it became liquid gold. Most medieval cities relied on wells or rivers. Guess what besiegers loved to do? Poison the water supply. Dead animals, human waste, diseased corpses. All fair game for biological warfare. Turns out Geneva Conventions were centuries away. So what did people drink? Beer and wine, obviously. Not because they were party animals, but because fermentation killed most of the nasties that made water deadly. The alcohol content was lower than modern drinks, about 2 to 3%, just enough to make it safer than water. Children drank small beer, which was basically barely alcoholic water, still better than cholera. Here's a fun fact nobody talks about. Siege cities often had more deaths from disease than starvation. Dysentery, typhoid, cholera. The 4 horsemen of the apocalypse had nothing on contaminated water during a siege. You'd survive the hunger, only to be taken out by a bad cup of water. By month 4, assuming the siege lasted that long, things got properly desperate. This is when the rat recipes came out. And yes, there were actual recipes. Rat pie, rat stew, rat on a stick if you were feeling fancy. The city of Paris during the 1590 siege even had rat vendors. Street food, medieval style. The going rate? 1 rat cost as much as 2 chickens would have before the siege. Supply and demand, baby. When rats are the only fresh meat available, they become a delicacy. There are accounts of nobles sending their servants to buy rats at premium prices. Michelin stars need not apply. Speaking of protein, let's talk about the elephant in the room. Or rather, the horse in the stable. Horses were transportation, warfare equipment, status symbols. They were also 1,000 pounds of potential dinner. The psychological barrier to eating horses was huge in medieval Europe. These weren't just animals. They were companions, workers, weapons of war. But hunger has a way of adjusting moral boundaries. First went the pack animals, then the war horses, finally the prized destriers of knights. There's a heartbreaking account from the siege of Antioch where knights wept as they butchered horses they'd raised from foals. War is hell, but siege, warfare, was hell with menu planning. And when the horses ran out, dogs, cats, anything with a calorie count. The Siege of Maastricht in 1579 has records of cat meat selling for 3 times the price of pre-siege beef. Let that sink in. People were paying premium prices for fluffy. Here's where modern sensibilities really get tested. When you've eaten through the rats, the horses, the pets, what's left? Leather. Yes, leather. Boots, belts, saddles. Anything made from animal hide became food. The preparation method was basically boil it until it's theoretically digestible. Shield covers, bookbindings, even leather hinges from doors went into the pot. The recipe, if you can call it that, was simple. Boil the leather for hours, days if necessary. Add whatever herbs or salt you still had to mask the taste. The result was a gelatinous, foul-smelling mass that provided just enough calories to keep you alive. Barely. One chronicle from the Siege of Jerusalem in 1187 describes soldiers gnawing on their shields like dogs. That's not metaphor. That's Tuesday dinner when you're 10 months into a siege. But humans are remarkably adaptable creatures. Even in the worst conditions, they found ways to make food slightly less awful. Siege cookbooks, and yes, those were a thing, recommended adding vinegar to leather soup to break down the fibers. Pine needle tea for vitamin C to fight off scurvy. Bone marrow from long-dead animals for precious fats. Let's talk about one of history's most famous siege meals. During the siege of Leningrad in World War II, people made bread from wallpaper paste. But medieval folks beat them to it by about 600 years. During the 1241 siege of Kiev, defenders scraped dried paste from between stones, mixed it with sawdust, and called it bread. The paste was made from flour and eggs, so technically nutritious. The fact that it had been holding walls together for decades was just extra flavoring. Now here's the really dark part. We've been dancing around it, but historical records are clear. When you've eaten the animals, the leather, the paste, and the rats won't come near because even they know better. What's left? Other humans. Cannibalism during sieges wasn't common, but it wasn't unheard of either. The siege of Ma'ara in 1098 during the First Crusade has documented cases. The siege of Numantia in 133 BCE. The siege of Samarra in 1609. When the choice is death or the unthinkable, some people chose the unthinkable. Medieval chroniclers, usually quick to describe every gory detail of warfare, become suddenly vague when discussing siege cannibalism. They ate strange meats. Unspeakable acts of hunger. They sustained themselves by ungodly means. You can practically feel their discomfort through the centuries. But here's what's actually fascinating. Even in the most desperate situations, there were still food taboos that held. During the 1295 siege of Amiens, records show people starving to death rather than eat meat. On Fridays, the siege of Acre in 1291 saw Muslim defenders maintaining halal practices even while eating rats. Religious dietary laws apparently outranked the survival instinct. Speaking of religious complications, let's discuss feast days during sieges. The Catholic calendar had about 180 days where meat was forbidden. That's half the year where your already limited protein options got even more limited. Fish? Good luck finding that in a landlocked city under siege. The solution? Creative interpretation of religious law. Beavers were classified as fish because they lived in water. Problem solved. Except, the minor issue of finding a beaver in a besieged city. Barnacle geese got the same treatment. They supposedly grew from barnacles, which came from the sea. Therefore, fish. Medieval logic was wild. Here's a detail that'll ruin your breakfast. Eggs, when available, were worth their weight in gold during sieges. But without refrigeration and under stress, hens didn't lay much. So defenders got creative. They'd pickle eggs in vinegar, bury them in salt, anything to preserve them. There are accounts of eggs being eaten months after being laid. The smell was apparently indescribable. The taste, worse. Let me paint you a picture of daily meal service during a typical siege. Morning meal was usually water or weak beer with whatever passed for bread. Maybe 200 calories if you were lucky. Midday was the main meal, a pot of perpetual stew. Everything edible went in, never came out. Just keep adding water, and whatever you could find. Evening was leftovers from midday plus more bread. Total daily calories, maybe 800 and 1,000 for common folk, compared to the 3,000, 4,000 they needed for medieval manual labor. Do the math on how long you can survive that deficit. The perpetual stew deserves its own moment of horror. Imagine a pot that never gets washed, never empties, just eternally simmering with weekly additions of increasingly questionable ingredients. Tuesday's rat bones, Friday's leather strips, Sunday's mysterious meat that nobody asks about. The flavors didn't meld so much as mutually surrender. Medieval physicians, bless their hearts, tried to help. Medical texts from sieges recommend eating grass, prepared as the cows do, which I'm pretty sure means raw. They suggested acorn flour could prevent scurvy. Spoiler alert, it couldn't. They prescribed pine bark tea for strength. It probably just made you forget you were hungry by making you violently ill. One particularly optimistic medical text from 1423 suggests that hunger could be cured by thinking of pleasant foods while chewing leather slowly. That's not medicine. That's sadism with a medical degree. But here's something genuinely incredible. Human ingenuity during sieges led to actual innovations in food preservation and preparation. The pressure of starvation created techniques we still use today. Smoking meat, perfected during sieges. Pickling vegetables, siege survival, tactic. Even certain fermentation techniques came from desperate attempts to make inedible things digestible. The Siege of Rouen in 1418 gave us one of the first recorded instances of systematic food inventory management. They created ration cards, tracked supplies, established distribution centers. It's basically the medieval version of World War II's ration book system, just 500 years earlier. Now let's talk about siege economics, because even starvation had a price tag. Food prices during sieges followed a predictable pattern. Week 1, prices double. Month 1, they're 10 times normal. By month 3, you literally can't calculate it because money became worthless. Food was the only currency that mattered. There are records from the Siege of Antioch where a single egg cost a month's wages. A pound of flour, 3 months' wages. A live chicken. You could buy a house for what people paid for poultry. But here's the thing. Nobody had wages anymore. The economy collapsed. Barter was king, and what you bartered was whatever you hadn't eaten yet. Rich merchants who hoarded food became targets. There are numerous accounts of food riots during sieges where starving citizens stormed private granaries. The social contract breaks down real quick when everyone's grandma's gnawing on boot leather while the mayor has a wine cellar full of preserved foods. One particularly dark economic note. Professional rat catchers became medieval one-percenters during sieges. They knew the sewers, the hiding spots, the breeding grounds. A good rat catcher could name his price. There's actually a recorded guild dispute from the Siege of Orleans about rat-catching territories. Imagine union disputes over who gets to harvest which sewer. That's peak siege economics. But humans adapt, humans survive, and humans sometimes even thrive. Some of the best military innovations came from siege necessity. The Romans invented a type of hardtack biscuit specifically for sieges. Rock hard, tasteless, but it kept for years. Medieval armies copied it, called it biscuit, and it became ship's biscuit that fed navies for centuries. Here's my favorite siege food innovation. During the 1524 siege of Marseille, defenders invented a method of extracting protein from bones that had already been boiled for soup. They ground the bones to powder, mixed with the last of their vinegar, and created a paste that was allegedly only mildly repulsive. That's a 5-star Yelp review by siege standards. We need to address siege psychology too. Hunger does things to the human mind. After a few months of severe calorie restriction, people reported vivid food hallucinations. Soldiers on watch would swear they smelled fresh bread baking. Defenders would dream so intensely of food they'd wake up chewing their pillows. There's a haunting account from the Siege of Carcassonne where a defender wrote that he could no longer remember what meat tasted like, only that he missed it. The human brain literally starts deleting food memories to protect you from the psychological trauma of hunger. That's some dark evolutionary programming. Children born during long sieges sometimes never learned what normal food tasted like. Imagine thinking rat and leather soup is just what dinner is. There are records of siege children being physically unable to digest normal food when the siege ended because their systems had adapted to survival rations. Speaking of siege endings, let's talk about what happened when the gates finally opened. You'd think it would be celebration and feasting, right? Wrong. Refeeding syndrome killed more siege survivors than the actual siege. Starved bodies can't handle normal food. Eating a regular meal after months of leather soup could literally kill you. Medieval physicians had no idea why survivors died after being saved. They thought it was delayed effects of siege miasma, or the revenge of eaten sins. Nope. Just basic biology saying you can't go from 800 calories of bark bread to a feast without consequences. The smart money was on soup. Thin soup, then thicker soup, then maybe some actual vegetables, and weeks later, if you were lucky, meat. The tragedy was many survivors, driven mad by hunger, couldn't control themselves. They'd gorge on the relief supplies and die within days of freedom. But here's the thing that amazes me about medieval siege survival. The social bonds, the community spirit, the sharing of resources even when there was nothing to share. Most accounts talk about communal kitchens, shared meals, equal rationing regardless of prior social status. Starvation was the great equalizer. There are beautiful accounts of siege communities creating elaborate fake feasts. They'd set tables with empty plates, go through the motions of a meal, tell stories about favorite foods. It was psychological survival through collective imagination. If we're all going to starve, at least we'll pretend together. Religious communities during sieges often fared better, not because God provided, but because monks and nuns were already used to fasting, already had communal kitchens, already practiced food discipline. Monastery records from sieges show better survival rates and fewer instances of violence over food. Turns out voluntary fasting is good practice for involuntary starvation. One fascinating detail: siege cities often maintained special reserves for pregnant women and nursing mothers. Even when everyone was starving, there was recognition that the next generation needed protection. It wasn't much, an extra ounce of bread, a bit more clean water, but it was something. Medieval priorities could be surprisingly modern. Let's be real though. For every heartwarming story of community solidarity, there were 10 of betrayal, hoarding, and desperation. Sieges brought out the worst in people as often as the best. Parents stealing from children, neighbors poisoning neighbors for their rations, guards taking bribes to look the other way while people snuck out to forage and got shot by besiegers. The black market during sieges was insane. People would risk death to smuggle food through siege lines. A single successful run could set you up for months. If you survived, most didn't. But when the choice is certain starvation or a probable arrow to the face, you take the arrow odds. Here's a fun detail nobody mentions. Siege defenders got creative with psychological warfare through food. During the siege of Carcassonne, defenders famously fed their last pig all their remaining grain, then threw it over the walls. The message: we have so much food we're feeding pigs for fun. The besiegers, thinking the city was well supplied, gave up. The defenders ate leather that night, but they won. Similar story from the Siege of Dubrovnik. Defenders would cook elaborate fake meals near the walls, making sure the smell drifted to enemy camps. Psychological warfare with grocery lists. The actual defenders were eating boiled seaweed, but the enemy didn't know that. Let's talk about specific siege recipes that have survived. Yes, people actually wrote these down. How to prepare rat in 7 ways. Making the most of your leather goods. Nutritious bark. A guide. These weren't cookbooks so much as survival manuals with culinary desperation. One recipe for siege bread from 1480. Take 3 parts sawdust, 1 part flour if available, 1 part ground acorns. Mix with water and prayers. Form into flat cakes. Bake on hot stones. Serves 8 if they're not picky. I love that even starvation recipes included serving suggestions. Another gem. Leather soup for 50 men. Take 20 pounds of mixed leather goods. Boil for 2 days, changing water once if possible. Add salt if available, vinegar if not. Serve hot to mask texture. Nutritional value questionable, but better than nothing. That last line really sells it. But my absolute favorite is this. Emergency protein paste. Collect all bones, including fish if available. Grind to finest powder possible. Mix with any available fat or oil. Form into small cakes. Fry if fuel permits. Taste improves with extreme hunger. At least they were honest about the flavor profile. Time for some siege statistics. That'll ruin your day. Average weight loss during a 6-month siege, 40% of body weight. That's not a diet. That's controlled dying. Infant mortality during sieges, 90%. Elderly survival rate. Don't ask. The longest recorded medieval siege was Candia, lasting 21 years. 21 years. Imagine your entire childhood being nothing but siege rations. An entire generation growing up thinking rats were a food group. Although to be fair, after year 5, they'd established pretty stable smuggling routes. Still counts as a siege though. Here's what gets me. After all this horror, all this starvation, all this desperation, you know what happened when most sieges ended? The winning army would burn all. The food stores to prevent the city from rebelling again. Months of carefully rationed supplies, destroyed in hours. War doesn't just break your body, it breaks your soul, and then sets fire to the leftover sandwiches. But humans endure. Cities rebuilt. Surprising nobody, the first businesses to reopen after sieges were usually bakeries and taverns. There's something beautifully human about surviving months of starvation and immediately opening a pub. Post-siege feasts were legendary affairs, not because of the quality of food, which was usually pretty basic, but because of what it represented: survival, community, the human ability to endure the unendurable. These weren't meals, they were celebrations of still being alive. The legacy of siege cuisine, if we can call it that, lived on in surprising ways. Many traditional European dishes originated as siege foods. Black pudding, siege invention to use every part of the animal. Certain fermented foods, siege preservation techniques. Even some modern military rations can trace their ancestry back to medieval siege supplies. Here's what siege food teaches us about human nature. We're incredibly adaptable. We can survive on almost nothing. We can find ways to make the inedible edible. But more importantly, we can maintain our humanity even in the worst conditions, sharing food when there's none to share, creating community around empty tables, finding hope in leather soup. So next time you complain about your lunch, remember the defenders of Calais. Next time you think you're hungry, think about 11 months of bark bread. Next time you see a rat, be grateful you don't have to calculate its nutritional value. Medieval sieges were hell on earth, but they showed us something important. Humans will eat anything to survive. Literally anything. Leather, bark, rats. Worse. But they'll also share their last crumb with their neighbor. They'll maintain their dignity while gnawing on boots. They'll create community in the midst of catastrophe. Modern preppers stockpile MREs and canned goods. Medieval people didn't have that luxury. They had to improvise, adapt, survive. And somehow, against all odds, enough of them did survive for us to be here today, complaining about our food delivery being 5 minutes late. The real lesson of siege food isn't about cuisine. It's about resilience. It's about the human ability to endure the unendurable. It's about finding ways to maintain civilization even when you're eating your shoes. It's about the triumph of human stubbornness over biological necessity. Would you survive a medieval siege? Probably not. Most people didn't. But if you did, you'd come out of it with a whole new appreciation for basic bread. You'd never waste food again. You'd probably have some serious nutritional deficiencies and PTSD, but you'd be alive. And that's the ultimate medieval siege recipe. Take whatever you have, add desperation, season with hope, serve with solidarity. It won't taste good. It might kill you, but it's better than giving up. Bon appetit, I guess.